All right. So, as I said, we have a wonderful presentation with two very amazing people. I'm going to start off by introducing Dr. Brian Meyer, who is a PhD in LCP. Dr. Meyer is a clinical psychologist and psychology program manager and supervisory psychologist for the community-based outpatient clinics at the Central Virginia VA healthcare system and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Virginia Commonwealth University. He obtained his AB from Harvard University in 1980 and his PhD in clinical psychology with a specialization in adolescents and families from Duke University in 1990. Dr. Meyer has worked in the child welfare and the child and adult mental health fields as a clinician, administrator, teacher, policymaker, program developer, expert witness, researcher, consultant, and trainer. He has been the deputy clinical director of the New Mexico CYFD Protective Services Division, the executive director of the Albuquerque Child and Family Guidance Center, the executive director of the Virginia Treatment Center for Children, and the interim associate chief of mental health clinical services, the workplace violence prevention coordinator, and the PTSD SUD specialist for over 11 and a half years at the Richmond VA Medical Center. In his current roles, Dr. Meyer oversees psychologists at 6 regional VA community clinics, provides evidence-based treatments for veterans who have problems in PTSD, substance abuse, depression, TBI, and other co-occurring conditions, trains psychology trainees, and develops and conducts research on treatments for PTSD, substance abuse, and comorbid conditions. Dr. Meyer is also a nationally in-demand speaker who has given over 400 presentations and trainings on a wide range of content areas, including the treatment of trauma and comorbid conditions, substance abuse, and complex trauma, the effects of trauma and substance abuse on families, veterans' mental health, mindfulness, meditation, uh, secondary traumatization, and self-care trauma-informed courts and treatment courts. He is also the co-author of Transcending Self-Therapy, Group Integrative Cognitive Behavioral Treatment book for facilitators, 2019, a treatment manual for people with substance use disorders, along with Dr. Jared Reisweber. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. He has been happily married to his wife, Charla, for 35 years and has 3 adult children and 1 granddaughter, all of whom he adores. Our second presenter, Dr. Matthew Stimmel, is a PhD, is the National Training Director for the Veterans Justice Programs, VJP. In his role, Dr. Stimmel is responsible for developing and sustaining the education and training of over 400 VJP field staff, contributing to national VA policy on justice-involved veterans, and cultivating operational partnerships, both internal and external to the VA, that advances VJP's mission of ensuring access and care to justice-involved veterans and reducing risk of recidivism and homelessness in this population. He is also a clinical instructor at the Stanford University School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. Matthew has been employed by the VA since 2013, initially completing a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical psychology within the PTSD emphasis area at VA Palo Alto Healthcare System, and the transitioning to staff role as a clinical psychologist and veterans justice outreach specialist in 2014, where he helped to establish several veterans treatment courts in Northern California. Matthew received his PhD in clinical psychology from Fordham University with a specialization in forensic psychology. So, very wonderful presenters with extensive backgrounds. We really appreciate y'all presenting. Before we go into the presentation, if Monique, you could briefly go over the housekeeping rules, and I believe you've already started pasting that into the chat for us.
Yes, I have. Hello, everyone. The Division 18 VA section officers and committee members serve in their roles and responsibilities for the Division 18 VA section and are not hosting or speaking as representatives or employees of the Veterans Health Administration in any forum, nor do they speak on behalf of the Veterans Health Administration. Division 18 VA section values diversity, equity, and inclusion. We ask that participants and hosts maintain an environment of respect and professional discussion throughout the webinar. The Division 18 VA section does not tolerate disrespectful language or behaviors, psychological or verbal abuse during webinars. Individuals engaging in such behaviors may be removed from the webinar. All webinars are recorded, and recordings may be found at the Division 18 VA section YouTube channel and Division 18 VA section webinar page. Please use the Q&A feature to ask any questions, as it helps us to track the questions as best we can. For individuals using the Zoom link provided to them at registration and follow-up, you are automatically recorded in the Zoom webinar attendance report. Anyone calling in by phone or otherwise not using a Zoom link, the Zoom link from the registration, must contact the Division 18 VA section Education and Training Committee and provide their name and telephone number used to verify attendance. For all attendees, links for feedback surveys will be sent in a follow-up Zoom email. This survey is optional and anonymous. This and other housekeeping details will be placed in the chat for your reference. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Monique. And without further ado, we're going to go to the presenters. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to get the slideshow started. And I'm just going to swap this. And there we go. So Matt and I are delighted to be here and talking with you about this subject. And we'll get right into it. I want to be sure that people understand that these are our views and not the views of the Veterans Administration or the US government, for whom both of us work. And we start with this, which is the basic thing that underlines our beliefs, which is that each and every veteran suicide is a tragedy. If we look at veteran suicides over time, what you can see, and this is the most recent data we have from the last VA suicide report, is that you can see that veteran suicides have stayed actually over time relatively flat, while non-veteran adults, the rates of suicide went up until just a few years ago and have just barely started coming down. If we are looking at veterans and we're looking at veteran suicide, and this is the rates, not the numbers, you can see that the rate of veteran suicide, as we have known, has been higher than the rate of civilian suicide. However, having seen this again over the last couple of years worth of reports, we've finally seen a downturn in the veteran suicide rate, and so that is hopeful, but not nearly enough. The VA has helped to do this by a lot of different efforts. There have been a lot of targeted VA suicide prevention efforts. I mean, when I came here 14 years ago, we barely had suicide prevention coordinators and suicide prevention case managers, but there are all sorts of things that we've done, providing gun locks. We've set up centers of excellence. We have standardized suicide prevention screens, suicide prevention evaluations, suicide prevention plans, reach vet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those have really been targeted to folks in VA care. There have been other efforts that we've done on for the entire veteran population, which includes Veterans Crisis Line with 3 specialized call centers. And more recently, we've done broader efforts than that even, where we have been focusing on partnerships with community organizations through the Mayors and Governors Challenges. And this is the critical fact upon which everything in this presentation turns. And that is that, and this is the most recent data, which while it's published in 2022, comes from 2020, which is that we have about 17 veteran suicides per day, and about 40% of those had VHA encounters. In other words, they were involved with VA services, where 60% had no VA services in the previous couple of years. And so what that says is that veterans who are not connected to the VA for services are more likely to kill themselves, about 50% more likely to kill themselves than those who are VA connected. So if we're really going to make a dent in this, if we really want to bring the veteran suicide rate down and bring it down significantly, it becomes really important to target efforts to the 10 of 17 veterans who aren't in VA care, who commit suicide every year. We really have to target that subgroup. And so if we want to figure out how to target them, one subset of them, but a fairly large subset of them, is veterans with other than honorable discharges, who by and large, on average, don't get a lot of VA care. They are a very high-risk subgroup, and they are starting to get more care, which we will talk about. But in general, they are a group that we can kind of bring our heads together around and get our hands on. And so that means that we need to think about who are these people. And here's the important thing about them. Veterans with other than honorable discharges are 3 times as likely to experience suicidal ideation. And if they are given access to VA services, in a recent study, Hoffmeyer and colleagues found that in fact, they drop to equally as likely to experience suicidal ideation. And now, when it comes to committing suicide, we know that veterans with other than honorable discharges are twice as likely to commit suicide and than other veterans are. So this is a really good population and a big chunk that we can work on. Oh, and this is really hard to see, and I'm not sure why that is. Basically, what this says is that by targeting them, we could take a big chunk out. If we look at the veteran suicide, the other than honorable discharged veterans, we know that since 9/11, so basically in the last 22 years, there have been about 125,000 veterans who have received other than honorable discharges. Oh, whoops, there it is. It's just showing up. Okay, so there you are, the 125,000. Having said that, then, well, we need to go back and define what's another than honorable discharge. And this goes back to all the types of military discharges, which I'm just going to go over really briefly. There's honorable, there's general under honorable conditions, which means that they're small, they do some small things, but they're still satisfactory. Other than honorable, which is there is a significant departure from what is expected of their conduct and performance. There's bad conduct, and there is dishonorable. The last two are both determined by court-martial. So what are they eligible for? Well, people with honorable discharges have full benefits, everything. General under honorable conditions means that they can get VA disability, healthcare, and most other benefits. They may or may not be eligible for the GI Bill, service on veterans commissions, and some other things. If we're looking at other than honorable, which is the group we're focusing on today, this rating is a commander-determined rating. That is to say that it can lead to inequity depending on how a commander feels about a particular veteran. That if a commander doesn't like, or I mean, they're an active duty service person at the time, but if a veteran, if they are not liked by their commander, then they could be at greater risk of getting an other than honorable discharge. And there are high variations in these rates from commander to commander. And most importantly, it really changes the trajectory of a person's life. If someone gets an other than honorable discharge, and we're going to talk about the consequences of that in just a moment, there are many things ranging from self-esteem to homelessness to involvement in the criminal justice system to not having VA benefits like healthcare, not having the GI Bill to get more education, and they can end up with all sorts of other kinds of problems as a result of these things. And that doesn't even speak about the loss of how they feel about themselves and how they feel about how other people view them. Now, it is important to understand that if you have an other than honorable discharge, you're supposed to receive what is called a character of service review. And there is actually a place on the DD 214, and I will show it now with the red circle. This thing, there is a box on this which says character of service. And it's very interesting when you're looking at veteran DD 214s, some of them don't have anything that is even said there. Now, if they get something in that little box on the DD 214, and it says honorable for VA purposes, then they can get the medical benefits. Then they can get disability benefits. They can get vocational services, and they can get some other services. They don't qualify for a GI Bill. Now, they can still qualify for health care for a service-connected condition, but the honorable for VA purposes rating is really critical. However, a lawsuit by the Veterans Legal Clinic in 2016 found that 90% of veterans with other than honorable discharges never get a character of service review. 90% of them, even though they're all supposed to get it. And that is what can qualify folks with an other than honorable discharge for services. But they don't get the rating, they don't get the services. There are two other kinds of discharges. There's the bad conduct ones where they lose almost all benefits unless they have honorable for VA purposes. Again, but in their case, they can only get disability compensation. And dishonorable, they get nothing at all. And they lose a lot of other kinds of rights. They can't buy a firearm. Some states won't allow them to vote, serve on a jury, hold office, etc. So if you're looking at all of these, if you put together other than honorable plus dishonorable plus bad conduct, those are called bad paper discharges. 81% of that group, however, is other than honorables. And so how common is this? Well, you know, I mentioned the 125,000 figure, which is since 9/11. If you go all the way back to 1980, you'll find out that there were 575,000 bad paper discharges. And most of those, 98, almost 100%, were enlisted folks. They were not the officer corps. So if you're looking at bad paper discharges, they have changed over time. And this graph basically shows you how they've changed over time from World War II to post 9/11 veterans. And what you can see is that back in World War II, less than 2% of veterans got bad paper discharges. But nowadays, if you're looking at it, almost 15% of enlisted service members get bad paper discharges. So this has been an enormous rise. The enormous rise has not generally been around the punitive discharges. Those have stayed pretty stable over time. That's the gray line at the bottom. If you're looking at other than honorable, that's the teal cover, the colored stuff. And you can see that it has risen over time so that it was once upon a time less than, in World War II, less than 1% of the population. And these days, now it is 5.8% of the time. And then you can see that there's general under honorable conditions. And you can see that that is another 8.4%. So these character of service reviews that I'm talking about are really important. And what they really mean is that if somebody has an other than honorable status, that does not mean that they can't get VA services. They may be able to, or they may not. And the problem is we're not evaluating these people to determine if they do. And we can't change in the VA somebody's discharge, but we can evaluate the character of service. Now, they first of all have to be what's called a veteran. I know, and that sounds weird because we all talk about veterans all the time, but to get a character of service review, you have to have been a full-time active duty member. You have to have had 25 months of continuous service, so a little more than 2 years. And you have a discharge that is not dishonorable. And you can look at these things. What are the factors that go into a character of service review? And you can see supporting evidence by third parties and the personal statement of a veteran, the length of their service and their accomplishments during service. In other words, they look at the whole period of service and not just what happened at the end. Character of service looks at the nature of their infraction, at the impact of their disabilities on their discharge. So if there's somebody with service connected for post-traumatic stress or for a TBI or for some other reason, that may have some impact on their discharge. They'll also evaluate third-party records and whether any mitigating or extenuating circumstances had some sort of effect. That's what's encompassed in character of service. And the people who do this are the Vero office, in other words, the VBA folks. They do make administrative decisions. And here's what's interesting. There are actually all sorts of legal rights about a character of service review. And so the person who is making the claim has the right to submit evidence. They have the right to an in-person hearing. They have a right to legal representation. And the VA has responsibilities to help them find the records and get exams that they need. And they still have appeal rights, even if the first go round says, no, they don't get an upgrade. They aren't eligible for VA services by virtue of the other than honorable. Well, the character of service, that can be appealed. This is a very complicated slide, but it is something that was put together by the Congressional Research Service, and it basically is a decision tree that has to be gone through in order to determine whether somebody with an other than honorable discharge is eligible for any VA services, and if so, which ones they're eligible for. So it's actually pretty complicated. There has been some recent good news. Back in 2020, the U.S. Army agreed to reconsider some of these less than honorable discharges, about 3,500 of them, by looking at post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health conditions. And that was a class action lawsuit that resulted in that. By the way, I did search this week to find out what happened to those 3,500. Haven't been able to find it. Similarly, back about 1.5 years ago, there was another class action lawsuit saying that the Navy and the Marines did not follow the standard of giving liberal consideration to upgrade other than honorable discharges if PTSD is involved. And the reason this lawsuit came about is because the Army and the Air Force were upgrading about half of those kinds of discharges when PTSD was involved, and the Navy and the Marines were upgrading only about 16%. In other words, if you were a soldier or you were in the Air Force, you were 3 times more likely to get an upgraded discharge for PTSD than if you were in the Navy or the Marines. Okay, so difference by service matters. That kind of inequity exists. So the Navy Review Board is supposed to be reconsidering all the discharges that occurred over a decade period from 2012 to 2022, and it allows folks who were in essentially the previous 11 years to resubmit their requests for upgrades. And I looked for the results of this to find out what has happened since then. And again, I was not able to find an update on this. I'm sorry to tell you. So next we have to think about, okay, if you get another than honorable discharge, what happens to you? And there's a whole lot of negative things that happen. One of the things that we have to think about is, how does mental health affect other than honorable discharges? And on the other side, what are the mental health effects of receiving one of these discharges? So here we go. Mental health effects. Well, they're 11 times more likely those who have PTSD compared to those without PTSD are 11 times more likely to be discharged for misconduct. They're 8 times more likely to be discharged for substance abuse. And how many of them were there? Well, we know that within a shorter period of time, 6 years that you can see there, the Army gave 22,000 veterans with PTSD or TBI other than honorable discharges. And we can also find that these people are often denied eligibility for veterans by the Board of Veterans Appeals about 3/4 of the time. If they've ever been psychiatrically hospitalized, they're more likely to be discharged for misconduct. Those who've been discharged were much more likely to have a mental health condition. Almost 2/3 of them had a mental health condition in the past 2 years. And out of them, 23% received these discharges. Now, if we're talking about people with combat exposure, these are other factors that can lead to it. Those with combat exposure are 25% more likely to get discharged. We know that 100,000 LGBTQ plus veterans were discharged with bad paper from 1945 to the year 2011. So if people were found to have an LGBTQ plus status, those people were discharged at very high rates. And so you're starting to see all these different factors which come in, which begin to make some of these discharges look rather arbitrary. There's also been racial disparities, not unsurprisingly, in the imposition of these discharges. So we know that if you're just looking at a 10-year period from 2006 to 2015, if you were Black, you were 1.3 to 2.6 times as likely as a white person to have disciplinary action taken against you. And another factor is that people with similar service histories, but were in different service branches, are more likely to get different kinds of discharges, as what I showed you just a couple of moments ago about Navy and Marines. Now we move to the other side. If you get another than honorable discharge, what happens to you? Well, there are a whole lot of mental health effects. There's shame. You feel like you're being punished. You feel like it's not fair. You can develop PTSD after the other than honorable that you didn't have beforehand. You can also get other mental health problems. And all of this includes things like bipolar disorder, psychotic disorder, personality disorder, suicidal ideation and behavior, and alcohol and substance use disorders. So the negative mental health consequences of these things are enormous. There are social problems that result from it, stigma, lower social support. They're more likely to be unemployed. They're more likely to have lower income, and they're more likely to be homeless than other folks. So there are a lot of really negative effects that can happen as a result. in addition, you can see that there's a lot of legal involvement. And for this, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Stimmel.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. I was just responding to a question in the chat, so let me just reorient myself first. What I'm really hoping to do is just expand on what Brian was just describing in terms of relationships among other than honorable discharges, legal involvement, and other key themes related to this topic, including, importantly, stigma, inequity, and risk. And I was just mentioning stigma in my response to that chat. It's a really important part of what we're going to be discussing today. So first, just want to give a quick landscape of demographic factors as it relates to incarceration for veterans. We unfortunately do see the same overrepresentation of marginalized group in the veteran incarcerated population as we do in civilian incarcerated population. So what that means is Black or African American veterans represent 22.7% of incarcerated veterans compared to 13% of the general veteran population. Latinx or Hispanic veterans represent 10.1% compared to 8%. And American Indian and Alaska Native veterans represent 2.2% versus 0.5%. Next slide, please. And if we look at veterans with other honorable discharges, they represent about 2.1% of the veteran population nationally, but 10% of the incarcerated veteran population. Excuse me. And since we know, as Brian was just mentioning, that OTH discharges are administered inequitably and with great discretion, and in particular with Black and LGBTQ veterans receiving a disproportionate number of OTH discharges, we can see that this effect might be reflected in the incarcerated veteran population. And so why does this matter? Well, we also know that veterans with criminal legal involvement are also at significantly elevated risk in 3 key areas, namely suicide, overdose, and homelessness. Next slide, please. So veterans with criminal legal involvement who are re-entering from prison are more likely to attempt suicide. Those who are involved in the court system and are re-entering are more likely to die by suicide. And so transitioning from incarceration to community reentry is a time of heightened risk for suicidal thoughts and behaviors, and these risks can persist for months after release. Additionally, actually, you can go to the next slide, please, talking about overdose, Brian. When it comes to overdose, transition and reentry to the community continues to represent significant risk as well. In the same sample from the study I just showed you, so this is over 5 million veterans who utilize VA services since 2016, and looking at those veterans who had contact with a Veterans Justice Outreach specialist of some kind versus those who didn't. We also saw that overdose risk was increased in this population, with veterans with criminal legal involvement having a higher rate of both fatal and non-fatal opioid overdose. And next slide, please. And then finally, we know that incarceration, whether long-term in prison or short-term, or with frequent kind of cycling in and out of the justice system, can also be tremendously disruptive to housing, which is, of course, then becomes a huge correlate to losing housing and becoming homeless. This is particularly problematic if you go to the next slide, Brian, if we think about the sort of intersectional nature of these risks. So homelessness, justice involvement are both associated with a host of other risk factors, which are unsurprisingly connected to one another, which includes poverty or lack of housing, loneliness and limited social support, trauma exposure, other mental health and substance use problems, multiple comorbidities with physical and other kind of cognitive or psychiatric needs, and then multiple psychosocial stressors, including legal involvement and unemployment. So I just want to pause for a second and talk about the intersectionality of risk. If you can actually go back for 1 second, Brian, that'd be great. None of these events, whether it's suicide, opioid use, homelessness, let alone losing one's job or the social support, occurs in a silo. And so it's really important to understand the unique impact of these events on different populations. And as an example, Brian and I presented this talk at the National Association for Drug Court Professionals annual conference earlier this summer. And there was a great presentation on opioid use disorder in communities of color. In that presentation, they talked about African American and Black men in communities with large income inequality were 2 times more likely to overdose, and their death rates were 7 times higher compared to their white counterparts. And so if we know that OTH discharges are unfortunately disproportionately represented among the Black African American community, and that's also true in terms of who is arrested and incarcerated in our prison system and jail system. We can understand that these risks don't occur alone. They interact with one another, and they really can have this really significant negative outcome for different veterans who are often marginalized by communities, and historically can be marginalized by VA. If you ever worked with a veteran who has an other honorable discharge, you may know that a lot of times when they've gone to the VA in the past, they've been told they're not a veteran, they've been sent away, they've been treated in such a way that these risks compound because of social isolation and a lack of connection to care. Next slide, please. So the good news, though, is that there are many protective factors that can mitigate these risks. And first and foremost of them is access to care, followed by a whole host of other psychosocial factors that can be protective. And if you look at this list, basically all of them are things that can be provided by the VA, which is really important to think about, especially one of the takeaways I'm hoping that you can get from this talk is how you can coordinate care with other VA providers in your system to make sure that veterans other than honorable discharges are getting access to all of these services. And if you, like I was when I was a postdoc and less familiar with the broader host of VA services, we can sometimes be in our own silos within VA. You might not realize that there is employment services available at VA and financial support management tools available through VA, family reintegration and other kinds of couple support through VA or vet centers and affiliated programs. So access to these services is literally life-saving. Next slide, please. And with that in mind, the VA has been for several years now expanding access to care for veterans with OTH discharges, in particular in the domains of mental health and housing. So you can see here several of these expansions for mental health care, which includes for veterans who may have experienced military sexual trauma, for those with service-connected disabilities, for those who may need emergency mental health care, as well as for those who may have had a serious mental illness diagnosed or psychosis diagnosed within 2 years of their service. And homeless programs, we've actually been serving veterans with OTH discharges for years, traditionally through our grant per diem and SSVF programs, and then recently in 2021, starting with our HUD VASH program. So in general, we're seeing a larger kind of array of VA services being made available to these veterans, which is great from a protective standpoint. Next slide, please. And so an even better news when we're seeing what that kind of translates into is we're finally seeing a significant increase in the access numbers for services for these veterans, with recent data suggesting a 270% increase in services utilized by veterans with an OTH discharge. Next slide, please. So just going to head to the synergy. So it's really important to think about how we work together with our community partners. Many veterans who die by suicide, as we've been talking about, don't access healthcare. And so understanding the risks for these veterans has to rely on both VA and community-based collaboration, because a lot of these veterans have been historically receiving their services in the community, and in many cases will continue to do so for a variety of reasons. So given this, helping our partners understand how to assess risk within non-mental health settings is important. So that could be primary care, that could be other kinds of VA services where our colleagues may be coming into contact with veterans. And this includes, I'm speaking largely about justice-involved veterans, but includes all veterans with other honorable discharges. Connecting those veterans to VA programming can facilitate access and eligibility determinations. Working closely with your Veterans Justice Program specialists. If you don't know them, I really encourage you to reach out to them at your VA medical centers. They're incredible resources, incredible advocates for these veterans, and they often have great relationships with your VA's eligibility and business office, because we're so often seeing veterans in custody or in the court who we don't know about their eligibility. So we're constantly completing 1010s and trying to enroll veterans in care. So they're a great resource for you. If you're not familiar with the program yet at your facility, please try to connect to your local VJP specialist. And then in instances where a veteran is not eligible, if they have justice involvement, your VJO or VJP specialist can help connect them to care in the community. We have to use our language very specifically, VA, not through the care in the community program, but rather through community providers that VJP specialists often work with through the court process and in other ways. They can help you connect a veteran with an OTH discharge to care in those instances. So there's lots of ways to leverage our relationship with community partners in order to serve this population. Next slide, please. So in terms of the treatment court side of things, I'm just going to talk about this quickly because I know a lot of you on the call probably don't work directly with veterans treatment courts, but many of you may work with veterans who are in those treatment courts. And hopefully as courts continue to expand, which they continue to do at a pretty rapid clip, I think we're upwards of 700 courts now nationally, which is huge growth over the last several years. Most veterans treatment courts will accept veterans with other than honorable discharges or those who may be otherwise ineligible for VA services. But still a large number don't. So around a third of courts still don't accept veterans who don't have access to VA care. The reasons that are often cited are either moral, like they've done something wrong and that's why they got their OTH, and so therefore they shouldn't be entitled to this benefit of an alternative court process either. Or they think, well, the VA is the best provider of care for veterans, and if they're not getting VA care, we don't have anyone else in the community who can provide it. And both of these are really kind of faulty beliefs, and perpetuates stigmatization of the discharge status type, as well as other problems that might have led a veteran to court, including legal involvement or other substance use or mental health problems that may be related to why they're in trouble with the law. And it doesn't take into account that whether or not the veteran can get care at the VA services, they still need care. And so excluding them from a process that can help link them to that care is really problematic. And then really importantly is that this is an equity and inclusion issue. The best practice standards for treatment courts specifically cite that equity and inclusion is an important component of any treatment court. And since we know rates of administering OTH discharges are impacted by race, sexual orientation, or gender identity, we know that if we limit access to care, we are reinforcing some of that marginalization and the stigmatization that those groups feel in this process. Next slide, please. And so I just want to quickly give a plug. We're actually in the midst, and some of you on the call may actually already be involved in this effort, but we in Veterans Justice Programs actually teamed up with VA Police and the Office of Mental Health and Suicide Prevention to develop regional trainings across the country. So we're going to all 18 VISNs. We've been to 7 thus far. We'll hit the remainder of 11, the remaining 11 by January, bringing together mental health clinicians, Veterans Justice Program staff, and VA police officers to coordinate the efforts we're making in the community to get veterans linked to care, including those with other than honorable discharges, to do exactly what Brian was saying we need to do more of, right? At the top of the presentation is doing more assertive outreach in the community to find these veterans and bring them into care. So there are a couple of links here and a couple of really promising programs. There are a lot more of these actually nationally. We're learning about them as we go to VISN by VISN, but the main focus of these is actually partnering further upstream to work with veterans in the community through local law enforcement or crisis responders to get them deflected into treatment before they get into trouble with the law. Because prevention obviously much better than doing intervention if we can make it happen. So there's a couple of examples of this. As I said, we have a 1.5-day long training that we give on this topic. So I won't go into it more here, but just to say, if you are interested in this, let me know. And I'd be happy to talk to you more about it. Next slide.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about what can you do. All right. So, I mean, this is more than audience participation. This is audience action is what we're asking for or recommending here, because there are things that can be done. The first thing that can be done, and maybe the most important, is getting a character of service determination. Remember what I said, that 90% of folks don't get this, and they are supposed to. And so how do you get it? Well, actually, you get it through the application for disability compensation, believe it or not. That automatically initiates a character of service review. So when somebody applies, they need to apply regardless of whether or not they actually, have something that can ultimately end up in a service connection. They need to make the application for it, and that's VA Form 21526E. But the easiest way to remember it is simply the application for disability compensation, because then they will get a character of service determination. And that is really powerful. And it's especially powerful because, a lot of these folks may have actually come to a VA, and then when they pull out their DD-214, it says that they have an other than honorable discharge. And what happens to them? They get turned away at the front door, because sometimes the people at the very front door who are doing the registration don't know that a person with an other than honorable discharge can in fact receive services under certain conditions. And, Matt was talking about what some of those conditions are. It is important to say that when people look at other eligibilities, and I'm not talking just about character of service, I'm talking about eligibilities like an eligibility for psychosis, an eligibility for military sexual trauma, a 90-day eligibility, etc. There are a lot of different kinds of eligibilities. In fact, there are 31 different eligibilities. But if somebody comes in and gets an eligibility determination, what you can see is that the eligibility determination rate, and this is, for recent years, in the last 5 years, is almost 3/4, okay, in granting access to healthcare and or other benefits. That's remarkable. So if people just get an eligibility determination, they have a 3/4 chance at getting some kind of benefits here. But we can't turn them away at our front doors. Veterans also have the ability to appeal these things. They can appeal a character of service determination, like I talked about before. They do have the ability to appeal a DoD discharge status, and I'll talk about that in just a second, how to do that. But then there are other questions, like, do they have more than one period of military service? Were they a Marine and then they didn't serve for a while and then they went back into the Army? I know quite a number of people who fit that. Can they claim insanity at the time that the act led to a discharge? There are so many different kinds of reasons somebody can appeal either their character service or the discharge itself. Now, if somebody wants to get a review of discharge, and there's the link to how to get it, and this is actually the form. It's DD form 293, and it's a form in which they can request that their discharge be reviewed for certain kinds of reasons. So, for example, if they were discharged other than honorable because they were in that period, if they were LGBTQ plus, that they would have been discharged from the military, well, they can do this appeal and have that kind of thing reversed. There are, however, it is important to say, even with the ability to apply for a discharge upgrade, only 8 to 13%, depending on the branch of military service, were actually given discharge upgrades. So what you can see is they're much more likely, if they get a character of service review, to be upgraded than if they get a character of discharge review that goes to DoD. Plus, the character of discharge review also is going to take longer. It takes 1 to 2 years. There are many reasons why they can get a discharge upgrade. You can see some there, mental health conditions, including PTSD, traumatic brain injury, military sexual trauma, sexual orientation. And there is actually online a VA upgrade wizard right there, and you can go and you can make it all happen right online, and that is the link to it. So it can be done online and pretty easy. On the other hand, when we're talking about all of the intersectional difficulties that people have that Matt was discussing, what are the chances that they're going to have access to Wi-Fi and they're going to have a phone or a computer that is going to enable them to do it and have the ability and knowledge to use those things together? Those are all lower because they get less education. They're more likely to be homeless. They're more likely to have job problems. They're less likely to have money to be able to afford these things. In general, we think what we need here is a public relations campaign. We need to have something that will inform other than honorable discharge veterans of different ways they can access VHA care. It can be an eligibility review. It can be a character service review, and it can be a review of discharge. Those are 3 different routes. And we need to let veterans with other than honorable discharges know about those 3 different routes to do it. How could we do this? Well, if we had some money that we could put into this, we could do public service announcements on the TV, radio, we could engage celebrities in them. We could put up billboards that people see as they go around the country. So even if those people have gone off grid, they can still see billboards. There's social media if people are on social media. There are websites where we could link them to other things. We could put out media material. We could put out a phone number where people could call to get more kinds of information about these things. If we had a major campaign to do this, we could really get a lot more folks with other than honorable discharges upgraded. Or at least access to VA services. So who can actually do this stuff? And so these are the audiences that we think need to learn about these things. Vet centers are one. Matt and I have done a regional presentation on this for vet centers. Veteran service organizations can get this information out. Veterans treatment courts, and Matt and I have done a number of presentations for veterans treatment courts to learn about these things. Community organizations that service veterans, community mental health centers where they're likely to show up because they're less likely to show up at the VA, county behavioral services, probation, because more of them get involved legally, as Matt talked about, or any organization that serves homeless veterans, and also letting the therapists who are involved with Give an Hour know about these kinds of things. All of those are different routes, organizations that we could target with a PR campaign to get this information out, because it is so much easier to have an eligibility or a character of service review, or even a character of discharge review, than it is to sit back and not provide this information and have this risk. Because if we could do this, we could really take a chunk of veterans that we've been talking about, which is a very large chunk of veterans, more than 500,000 of them. And we could help them get services that would then lower their suicide risk. And that's really the whole point here, is we want fewer veterans to be harming themselves and trying to commit suicide. And this is a whole nother angle. This is, a lot of times in the VA, what we've done is we've kind of gone in the front door on a lot of things. This is more like going in the side door. And this is a way of getting to people and at people that we have not done in any broad kind of strokes. There has been, I will say, a brochure that has been developed. Unfortunately, this brochure is already a little dated, I'm sorry to say. I noticed that when I looked at the Veterans Crisis Line, and it doesn't say 988*1 anymore in the lower right-hand corner. But basically, a number of the different eligibilities that we have talked about during this presentation are encapsulated in this brochure. There has been some availability made with this brochure through the homeless programs. And it just talks about, how can I do these things? What are the access points I have to get involved in the VA and get healthcare benefits, mental health care benefits? And so these are ways of doing it. And so what we want to leave you with is 2 things. First, we want to leave you with a thought. And this is Pete Buttigieg, who ran for president. When he was running for president, he was quoted in Task and Purpose. And now he's, the Secretary of Housing. So he said, no current or former military member of the military should ever be denied mental health care, period. Veterans who have service-related PTSD and currently have bad paper discharges ought to have their discharges upgraded so that they can receive VA care and benefits that we owe them. Going forward, active duty service members with a service-related behavioral health issue should not receive a bad paper discharge. We wholeheartedly agree. And the last thing we want to leave you with is that there is a list of resources here. There is the application here for disability compensation, which gets people a character of service review. There's a DD Form 293 for review of discharge. There is an online upgrade wizard for discharge upgrades. There's a fact sheet on character of discharge and VA benefits. All of these things are available to people as resources, and that we should be pointing our veterans towards. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing here, and Matt and I are going to take some questions.
Right, we might have time for about 1 or 2 questions. It looks like one is in the chat. So if VA character of service is supposed to be reviewed at discharge and 90% do not receive the review, do we know anything about barriers to compliance?
Well, one thing we know about it is that there is a training issue for people at registration. And the reason we know this actually comes from lawsuits against the VA. If you go into those lawsuits, what you find is that there are actually training materials that tell people in registration up front that people who have an other than honorable discharge are not eligible for VA healthcare. And so they just routinely can turn people away. Now, I will say that another lawsuit found that there was one VA in the country, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting which one it was, that actually gives it to 100% of the people who come in the door. And more power to them. We think that's great because their people are going to be less likely to kill themselves, and that really is the ultimate goal of all of this.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly to that, Brian. I do think Health Eligibility Center has been improving and creating more access for education information on this, and it is now actually the policy that if if a facility receives a 1010, that they are supposed to be entered and the character of service review triggered. Of course, it doesn't happen everywhere, but that is the sort of policy moving forward. And so I think that's just an important thing to remember, that this should be happening at the office. And then I appreciate the comment about CMPs. I just want to quickly add, because I know have a minute left. Brian was talking about a public service campaign, which would be great in an ideal world if VA was doing this everywhere. I know in a lot of ways it's trying. But if you're listening to this, it's now something that you are a part of. And that, one of our goals here is to share this information so you can go out and talk to your community partners and folks at the facility and see what's happening. Suicide prevention has expanded to include community engagement coordinators around suicide prevention. And so speaking to them at your facility, thinking about ways to sort of partner and get the word out locally is something that we can all do in our respective roles, and not just kind of wait in our offices for folks to come to us, because that won't happen. We've heard that very tragic story about someone's father kind of carrying the shame of OTH with him and not being able to get the services he needed. We really want to work hard to sort of take that shame away and bring people back in. And that takes us kind of stepping out of the ivory tower and kind of going out into the community and bringing folks in. So thank you.
Such a wonderful presentation. I know that it was so informative for me, and I know that it's definitely going to impact the way I look at things, as well as probably for many of the providers on here. So we really appreciate your time. That being said,
answer a quick question that was in this one is in the chat. asking if these slides are available to download. And so if you want a copy of just the slides and you don't want to see, the whole presentation over again, you can just email me. I'm there on Teams. I'm Brian, Brian .Meyer, Meyer @va.gov. So you can reach me there. If Matt wants to volunteer, he can volunteer too. I don't know, but you're welcome. You're welcome to do it. To just email me and say you saw this, and I'll be happy to share them with you.
Yeah, and very similarly, as we've put in the chat and kind of answered questions for, the slides will be available once we get them onto the Division 18 VA website, which takes a couple of weeks. But this recording in and of itself will be available on YouTube a lot sooner. So thank you, everyone. And thank you again to our presenters. We really appreciate y'all. I hope you all have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.